Hello and welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel. And today I am joined by Lisa Masé. Hello, Lisa.
Hello, Anna. It's wonderful to be here.
I've been really looking forward to this because ever since I first saw the title of your book, I've wanted to have this conversation. It is so intriguing. The title is The Culinary Pharmacy: Intuitive Eating, Ancestral Healing, and Your Personal Nutrition Plan. And here it is for everyone to see. There's just the title alone, I think, provides us with many threads to explore. So let's begin there. How is food a pharmacy?
So many nutrients that we need, from macronutrients, carbohydrates, proteins, fats, fiber, to micronutrients, vitamins and minerals, are comprised of the food that we have the benefit of eating. So not only does food help our bodies to thrive, but it also reconnects us with nature, which is who we are.
Indeed. And I think this is the key, that expression, excuse me, that expression, you are what you eat, um, is absolutely true. Because if we are putting all the nutrients that we need into our bodies, then we are going to thrive. And where do we get those nutrients? We get them from our food. And we think about herbs and herbal medicine. All of that is about keeping us in good health. So I think it's a very simple statement that food is a pharmacy. So it's good. Now, the other thing is the connection to ancestral healing. So tell us about that.
Absolutely. I had the great privilege of growing up in Italy and emigrated to the United States as a preteen. And that contrast really highlighted for me what a gift it was to grow up in an intact food culture with a family and a community that was really focused on local seasonal eating, wildcrafting, foraging, herbal medicine as ways of life. So coming to a place where beyond indigenous people who've been on the land for centuries here in the United States, many people are coming because they escaped oppression and because they, for some reason, had to cut ties with their roots. I started to realize how disconnect from our sources of nourishment certainly has a factor that has to do with how connected we are to our ancestors and the lands that held our ancestors as they lived and died. Reconnection with those ancestral lands, whether it's through looking at food maps and finding out which foods grew there indigenously prior to agriculture and starting to ingest those foods, or going back to those lands and learning what the agrarian traditions there are now, I think is a really potent way, not only of reconnecting with what are my true sources of nourishment beyond what anyone on the outside might tell me, but also why are these foods so deeply nourishing to me? Because the foods that were most kind of pre-programmed to digest and assimilate are essentially part of our DNA. We come into the world with this genetic messaging, right? Which traditional healing modalities might call our constitution. And then, of course, we're impacted by the conditions of our lives, like, for example, not growing up on our ancestral lands. And that has an effect on our constitution. And yet, there's always a homecoming that's possible. As we come home to our ancestral foods, we also come home to our bodies on a deeper level.
There's so much in this. And I think there's a very strong emotional element to this because in your experience, you were uprooted. And so that connection to your ancestry was cut. And we only need to see, I think this is the experience of the immigrant, because that disconnection from the food that we grew up with is huge. It's one of the reasons why immigrants, one of the first things that they do is set up restaurants of their traditional cuisine. And so just go across, America, go across the England, the British Isles, and you're going to see what immigrants have brought with them, that rich culinary tradition through the restaurants that are set up. And I think there is something very primal about that connection to food. And I feel very nostalgic for the foods of my childhood, because we were uprooted from Portugal when I was 8. And so there are certain fruits that I haven't had since I was 8 years old. And the thought of a loquat, which is hard to come by in London, it fills me with nostalgia. Recently, I was in a fishmonger's and they had clams. That's part of my childhood. And I was so excited to see clams. And of course, they came home. So, these are things that are very important to us. And we can see that that would be the case at an emotional level. But I think you're saying that there's something deeper than that, that there's something about the foods. Sorry, Teddy decided that he wanted to join in the conversation because
Of
food
course.
is to him too. So I'm just going to rephrase that. So it's easy to see that food is really important to us at an emotional level. But you're saying that even though that's huge, there's more to it. So explain that physical link that you feel is there.
Absolutely. We need look no further than the gut ecosystem or microbiome to really understand the deep physiological connection that we have with ancestral foods, in addition to the emotional connection, right? Because so many of our body's sensations and responses, both physically and emotionally, are mediated by the nervous system, which is absolutely informed by the gut, right? Neurotransmitters, basically made by gut bacteria, are the ones that secrete the majority of our stress and relaxation hormones. Yes, a few are secreted in the brain, a few are secreted by the adrenals. However, vast majority produced in the gut. So when we start to think about the emotional nature of foods and those nostalgic connections that you speak of, we start to understand that we take in the world not only through breath, our first source of nourishment, but also through smell, right? We remember with our sense of smell. Memory is olfactory. So you can already see how those memory centers of the brain are so deeply connected with our senses, our interoceptive senses, that awareness that comes from within. And so they're also stored, those memories, through those senses, which are interoceptive senses. Am I hungry? Am I thirsty? Do I have to go to the bathroom? Are so deeply linked with our digestive system. So when probiotics were essentially discovered as something that could be encapsulated in 2001, it was a huge breakthrough in the scientific community, right? And researchers started to help companies make broad spectrum probiotic capsules. However, in 2011, come to find out, we all have an enteric type, a gut type, which tracks to some extent with our blood type, which is fascinating. And research is still being conducted about this. However, I see patterns between gut types, blood types, and ancestry, right? So that being said, if I have a specific gut type, say bacteroides, which is pre-programmed to digest meat, and lo and behold, I grew up in a part of Europe, and my ancestors came from a part of Europe where there's a lot of wild game in day-to-day eating, then it stands to reason that those ancestral foods are also the most digestible by my gut microbiome, right? Constitution, genetics, same thing, tracks with digestibility of foods and therefore energy production and therefore wellness. So ultimately, the more we know about our gut type, and we can make a really good educated guess without getting very expensive testing. I talk about this in the book. The more we know about our heritage, which foods grew wild or roamed wild on the lands of our ancestors, and the more we can intentionally try those foods, right? Because yes, I grew up in Italy, and I certainly have an Etruscan strand in my family. I also have a Turkish strand that came with Roma people. I also have Welsh and Polish and French strands, right? So I, over time, have tried the wild foods from all of those lands and allowed my body to tell me which ones do I feel like I digest really well, which ones feel neither too activating nor too depressive or relaxing, but feel kind of stabilizing, right? And that might change a little bit as the circumstances or the conditions or the epigenetics of our lives unfold. And it's always kind of a template to come back to in understanding what our body might need in any given moment and sourcing that information from within so that not only can we have a regulated digestive system, but then we can also have a regulated nervous system, which in terms of digesting the trauma, or, that word in Greek means wound, right? The wounding of our modern world, we're just more equipped to be in a world that is totally outpacing the speed at which our nervous systems can even begin to calibrate or catch up.
The gut biome, the individual nature of the gut biome is a huge, huge thing because we know that, for instance, families can share a gut biome. So the bacteria are shared in the family to the point where we can share the bacteria of our pets as well, where that becomes part of our gut biome. So we are very linked to that very physical gut level that's there. So it makes complete sense when we consider how everything in nature adapts to its environment. Essentially, what we're saying here is ancestry matters because our gut biomes are adapted to the part of the world from which they originate.
Absolutely.
And when we think of that, it's so obvious, and yet it seems like a revelation.
Well, we've been disconnected from that knowledge, right? Not, all people, but many people have been. And this is a moment of reconnecting, right? We're seeing it in all of these different ways in the world. And this is the opportunity. Our gut microbiome, our internal ecosystem is much more Lisa or Anna than our personalities or our appearances, right? And that internal ecosystem is infinitely adaptable and also infinitely grounded in the intricacy of its relationality and how it functions, right? So it's not identity. It's about how all of the systems and all of the bacteria, yeast, and fungi are relating to each other, which is always changing. Health is a changing state of balance, right? Which is why we're always thinking about condition and constitution, epigenetics and genetics. So this truly is an opportunity, once we have this awareness, to reclaim sovereignty over our own eating and appreciate and recognize our bodies as sovereign beings with whom we get to be in relationship. And then that allows us to really see not only our own adaptability and relationality as the way to truly thrive, but it also provides this opportunity to, instead of vilifying symptoms and trying to medicate them away or cure them, embrace and appreciate symptoms as those interoceptive messages from within, our body's way of communicating with us and saying, we are sovereign beings in relationship, the body and the consciousness, and how can we interact more and more?
And that comes to a quote that I've written down from your book, where you say, "My disease became my teacher." And this is the whole thing about our body communicating with us. And the Western way has become to suppress the body by suppressing symptoms, rather than by asking, what is it that my symptoms are telling me at a deeper level about my health, and also, of course, my emotional state. So this is a very important part of things. Just coming back to the idea of intuitive eating, excuse me, um, it seems to me that very often we're confused about what we intuitively feel we need, the aspect of cravings, and then also what our rational brain wants to do for any number of reasons. So in particular, I'm thinking about, for me personally, my journey with food being one in which I had to come to terms with the fact that I do need to eat meat and I do need to eat fish. I am the granddaughter of many generations of fishermen. And I knew that fish would be always an important part of my diet, but it conflicted with my desire to look after animals and not eat meat. So that it's that these are the kind of issues we have to wrestle with. But something in your book which really struck a chord, because it is the means by which I came back to eating meat with a reasonably clear conscience, although I say reasonably because it's not 100%. I'm still not happy about it. And that is the idea of the sanctity and honoring of food, because that's huge. And it's, for me, the sin is to abuse animals in the way that they are reared and to treat them as though they are just products. And you echo that through your book. So talk us through your stumbling upon this crucial bit of information.
Absolutely. And I want to honor that fish is part of your ancestral heritage, not only as a way of connecting to the waters, right, that are so part of your heritage, but also as a way of taking that water in, and being nourished by it, right? And animals are extremely nutrient dense, as are nuts and seeds, right? An almond can create an entire beautiful, flourishing, massive tree. And so I think remembering not only the sanctity of foods and um, the equity and justice with which certain foods are raised and prepared, we can also start to realize, yes, these foods don't need to be prepared and offered in massive quantities because they're so nutrient dense. Um, and that is certainly part of intuitive eating, is this awareness of what are the nutrients that my body is getting from a food? How much work does it take to break them down? And then how much energy are those going to produce? How much nourishment and satiety will they produce? And I really spent my childhood surrounded with intuitive eating, didn't totally realize it until I was sick and sort of reclaimed it for myself. You know, we always said a prayer prior to eating. Um, and that was a way to allow the nervous system to settle, feel prepared to digest food, right? And in between all of the small courses that people eat in much of Europe, there is talking, there is connection. However, when people are eating, probably the only sound you hear in my family is, hmm, right? Because there's full attention being placed on the savoring of this sacred food. Um, so when I was quite sick, a friend basically wore me down until I went to a silent meditation retreat with her for a week. And I was terrified to go. I hadn't really left my house in 2 years. I had maybe 6 or 7 foods that I considered safe and would eat those pretty much all the time. And I knew that I'd be going to a place where other people would be cooking for me and I wouldn't have control over my food. And out of my, wide litany of symptoms, I'd say I had, probably a 75% reduction in symptoms and sensations of illness while I was at this meditation retreat. And that really revealed to me how much of the way that we relate to our food and we relate to our bodies in wellness or illness has to do with our nervous systems and has to do with kind of how regulated our nervous systems can be during the process of eating. So that was a huge turning point for me. And I started to realize, actually, I need to incorporate more foods. I can incorporate more foods when I surround them with my love and care and attention and with a blessing for the highest good. So that I was no longer, in fight, flight, freeze mode, but was actually able to allow my body to experience certain foods and tell me what it needed. And cravings really are, again, just like symptoms or sensations, they're information. And when we're trying to get to this place of taking in more of what we feel are our wild ancestral foods and allowing our bodies to tell us how they feel about the foods, slowing things down is tremendously helpful. And first engaging in a process of kind of regulating the gut microbiome to a place where the groups of bacteria, yeast, fungi that develop in response to highly processed foods kind of take a back seat. That process really only takes about a week. It might feel excruciating because those bacteria are going to secrete via the nervous system all of these hormones that say to the brain, feed me, I am starving, you're not giving me sugar. or chips or whatever it is, right? Um, and until finally, again, 3, 4, 5 days down the road, they sort of get the message and say, okay, you don't want to feed me right now. I understand. And there are plenty of other friends in the ecosystem to take up space, right? And so the brain is really kind of operating in isolation until it gets information from the nervous system, primarily via the vagus nerve, our first cranial nerve that talks to all of the organs from the gut to the brain before it delivers information about this is how we're doing. Until the brain gets that information from the vagus nerve, it doesn't really know what's going on in the body, right? So if we're trying to tune into really truly instructive cravings, like, ooh, I'm craving cinnamon. Right, it's because I ate that very rich food or that very, very sweet food, even if it's, honey or maple syrup or coconut palm nectar. And the cinnamon is coming in to help regulate my insulin response and my blood glucose. That's when we really receive this opportunity to embrace those instructive cravings as part of the conversation with our bodies that's not mediated by a bunch of processed food, non-food loving bacteria, which often actually are pathogenic and lead to all kinds of different issues in the body. So first and foremost, slowing down, and beyond that, going towards the whole foods as close to the source as possible. Um, and ultimately, I believe the goal is resiliency, right? So we want to create a relationship with our bodies that feels very strong, very rooted, so that, yeah, we're going to go out and eat the birthday cake or go to the pub and, have a pint or whatever it is that you enjoy doing, right? And the body's going to say, oh, no big deal. I know how to deal with that, right? It's the overconsumption of those foods that are highly activating to the nervous system and highly processed, therefore challenging to digest, that makes it harder to really trust our intuition.
And also just, a reminder that highly processed foods contain actually very small amounts of the food that is so they're supposed to have, and a high level of chemical additives, which mean that our bodies are going to struggle to recognize them. So this is it's so important that we understand that our bodies recognize some foods and not others, even to the point of the type of milk that we drink, where some of the proteins are easily recognized in some types of milk and not others. The difference between A2 type milk and the milk that is commonly available. We have so much intolerance of dairy, but that's because we're not drinking the dairy that our ancestors had. So it's, and if anything comes through this conversation, it's the importance of not generalizing what's good or bad beyond saying avoid processed.
Absolutely. We do not live in an ancestral food system, unfortunately, although in many parts of the world, including the UK, that is available, right? So the more we can invest in our local food systems, in our farmers who are growing without chemical inputs, the more we can come closer to restoring an ancestral food system. And the same reason that people don't tolerate dairy is the reason people don't tolerate wheat, right? It's not the wheat itself, it's the treatment of the wheat with pesticides and then the hybridization of those wheat seeds so that they can only be grown with pesticides and can't be saved. and regrown, and then the stripping of the bran and the germ from the wheat, which are the fiber and the fat that's needed to break down those carbohydrates when it gets turned into flour, thus creating a product that our body doesn't recognize and ultimately has to find other ways to digest, right? It's the same with high fructose corn syrup or extremely processed white cane and beet sugar. Very, very far from the original source of something like sugarcane, right? Which is extremely fibrous, very, very high in minerals. So part of this work of reclaiming our food, reclaiming our sovereignty over our bodies and our food is about investing in our local, chemical-free, unprocessed food systems.
Over and over again, you've used the word reclaim and you've used the word sovereignty. And I think in a time where all of us are having diktats thrown at us, to the point where we're now being told that, hey, folks, insects is the way forward. This has never been more important, because the disconnection from nature is becoming much deeper. And it feels as though we've all been bundled onto a ship that is getting further and further from the shores of our ancestors. And destination unknown, except it's not. We know where it's going because we're far enough from those ancestral shores to see the impact it's having on health all over the world. This is why it's so important that we understand the relationship that we have between our gut and our environment. And it makes me think also about the word that we use, terroir, recognizing that certain foods come from a particular soil, and that it is that soil that gives them the richness of their food. Now, you're Italian, and I have spent time in Sicily, and the volcanic soil of that island, the food is unlike any food I've had anywhere else. So this is
Absolutely.
important.
It's of paramount importance, and that's why slow food has the arc of taste, which is all of these foods that only exist and only taste the way they do when they're grown in specific soil. And these foods exist all over the world. And if you're curious to learn more about this, there's a great book by Dan Saladino called Eating to Extinction. And each chapter is about a different wild food that either has gone extinct or is about to go extinct, and kind of the process by which that happened and how traditionally people related to that food. So I think it's a really important awareness to hold. It's a really good reminder about why we need seed banks and need to be cultivating foods that are as close to the indigenous wild foods of our ancestral lands as possible, because our own survival depends upon it, as well as our pleasure and enjoyment of those delicious foods.
Okay, so let's get practical here. I can hear many people in the audience who are of immigrant, have the immigrant experience, saying, yeah, it's all very well, but we're not living where we came from anymore. So what do we do, Lisa?
So part of the nature of our food system is that those foods are likely available to you. As you said, loquats are hard to find in London. However, they're available, right? If I really had to find a loquat, even here in Vermont, I know where I would go. I would go to an international market in Montreal, in Quebec, and I would find a loquat there, right? So I think it's about first of all, cultivating that awareness of these are, what those foods were. And I have a map in my book from the Royal Society of Physicians in Edinburgh, beautiful food map of all the origins of food crops. So once you kind of understand where those foods came from and what they were, then there's a way to kind of retrace the path, right? Whether you actually go to those places and find those seeds, which is a wonderful journey, and I think a hero's journey in many ways, or whether you start looking around at local farms and finding a comparable version of those foods. The opportunity is there, right? And, even if your family is from, say, Southeast Asia and has a lot of coconut in their food maps, right? Despite the fact that our food systems are broken in so many ways, mostly due to processed food and, large scale industry, we also can reap the benefits of the fact that foods can travel worldwide and show up in many, many places, especially urban areas.
And there's also the fact that many in this country, we have allotments, and people from all over the world might have an allotment. And I see how they bring their seeds with them, so that there are people growing some very wonderful and different vegetables that come from the countries that they originate from. So I think instinctively, this is the issue, is that instinctively we want to do this because we have that emotional connection. It's a taste of home. Um, but it's understanding that actually we need to encourage that within ourselves and with each other, so that we are able to help our gut biomes live in foreign climes, if we might put it that way.
Absolutely. And be adaptable, right? And, when I talk about creating your personal nutrition plan in the book, it's not to say that that's at the exclusion of everybody else, right? So the more that I bring those ancestral foods that feel most digestible into my body, and the more that I honor that connection between the gut biome, the nervous system, the immune system, and all the other organ systems, the more that I become, again, so resilient that I can eat the Portuguese food or the Southeast Asian food, right? And have this experience of connection. Because ultimately, none of this food work thrives without connection and still feel like my body is in balance.
And two, the fact of the matter is that we've been trading in food forever. Food
Forever.
has been traveling around the globe forever, the spice trade, for instance. So there's always been a cultural interchange of food. So there is Portuguese influence in some parts of Indian food, for instance, like Goa, and we can see the influence of English food in some curries in certain parts of India, etc. So this connection, and Italian food also influencing other parts of the world or being influenced by other parts of the world. The fact that tomatoes come from South America, potatoes come from South America, but they're staples all over the world. All of these things are important to remember. We, but what you said there was so crucial. We have to understand where we come from, to understand what we need, and then we build the resilience, and then we can bring in the extras and enjoy them as well.
Absolutely. And the more we understand about ourselves and what we need, the more we can cultivate appreciation for other people, other cultures, and their needs, and see from an appreciation standpoint, as opposed to kind of, adopting and taking over, appropriating, from an appreciation standpoint, I can say, wow, I grew up making a bread that contains 4 seeds, fenugreek, caraway, cumin, and fennel that are not indigenous to the Italian peninsula. However, I know that all of those seeds grew wild in the Turkish steppes, and my Roma family line brought those on the caravans, and that's why they're in our rye bread, right? So cultural appreciation, yes, for what my family's bread is, and appreciation for how it came to us and the gift of connection that comes through that.
Appreciation is a huge part of this because it brings us to gratitude and the honoring that we've spoken of before. So it's knowing that this is not a throwaway product. It's something that is precious and important, that it is part of the land. It is honoring the animals that die to feed us. It is honoring the plants that feed us, and everything that goes with it is so huge. And I think there's a quote in your book that, or no, I'm quoting something in your book, which says it all. Food is the connection between people, place, and spirit. And I think that is the most perfect way to end our conversation.
Thank you so much. It absolutely is.
It's just, it sums it all up. So thank you so much, Lisa, for your book and for your time today.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
If people want to learn more about your work, how do they do that?
So you can absolutely purchase the book, The Culinary Pharmacy. It's available anywhere books are sold, online and in bookstores. If your bookstore doesn't have it, ask for it. And you can also reach out to me. My website is harmonizedliving.com. That's my business name, Harmonized Living. You can send me a note through the website. You can join my newsletter. And people reaching out is how I learn. So I always appreciate all the notes that I receive from folks because there's always a teaching for me in them.
Perfect. I'll put a link to both the book and your website in the description box. Lisa, thank you so much for your time once again.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for watching. Until next time, have a great week. Goodbye.